Welcome back to the Human Longevity Project. I absolutely love the messages in episode 7. Living your purpose, being part of a community, slowing down, so many ways to get back into harmony and balance. All of this is of course part of the longevity equation. If you often feel anxious, stressed, or overwhelmed, you're not alone. And if you happen to have missed episode 7 or any of the previous episodes because you've got too much on your plate, the good news is we've made this series available for you to own so you can watch it anytime. Now, unfortunately, most of us know someone suffering from chronic disease. Cancer, Alzheimer's, and dementia are all on the rise. What's causing this dramatic increase? And if you know somebody suffering from these issues, what can they do about it? We'll cover all of this and more in episode 8. Enjoy.
In a disease process where your body's breaking down, it's subject to stress, it starts to get unbalanced, and symptoms occur. They're the last thing to occur in a disease process. It doesn't matter if you're tired, fatigued, sinuses, allergies, moodiness, irritability, whatever it might be. Those are just the symptoms. They're signals something's wrong, and sometimes it's easy to get rid of them. You can take something for just about everything these days. But that doesn't fix you, that doesn't make you better.
The cause of dying of neurological disease, especially 80% of that being Alzheimer's disease, in women in the last 20 years has increased 663% in 20 years, which is an unbelievable, inconceivable number. And there is suggestions from the epidemiological community that half of the population alive right now in the West will die either with or of Alzheimer's disease. There's virtually no effort on government side, on policymakers to change that. There is an effort to fund ridiculous research and trying to create a drug to stop it, rather than looking at the causes and stopping those which are well known.
Alzheimer's is going out of sight, just like autism. It's terrifying. I think it was something like 15% of people alive today can be expected to be diagnosed with Alzheimer's in their lifetime. That is terrifying.
When patients come to my office, one of the biggest things I assess for is how healthy is your mitochondria. And one clue to that is there premature aging? Things like wrinkling of the skin at an earlier age or graying of the hair, fatigue.
When we look at the mitochondria, I mean, they're the powerhouse. They're basically the battery of the cell. So how well is your car going to run if you don't have a battery? Really, nothing's going to happen. That's what you need, that spark to generate everything to get your car to move. Or you need that battery charge to get your phone to work. And if that battery's not producing energy, nothing's going to happen. And that's the same thing in the brain. When the mitochondria are not functioning optimally, everything just goes down. You can't get a neuron to fire properly.
Mitochondria basically behave like bacteria. So if we have 100 quadrillion of them, we have 100 quadrillion bacteria that are actually moving around our body. Now, the way they reproduce is by fission. They divide, right? Just like any bacteria do. And then the way they move about is they either fuse with other mitochondria, forming long strands for when you need lots of energy. And in your neurons, where there are long axonal strands, for example, for the delivery of signals in the nerve cell, then the mitochondria actually move up and down. So there's fusion, there's fission, there's movement, and then there's this phenomenon called mitophagy. So what happens when a mitochondrion actually divides is that the division is very uneven for the number of mitochondria that would go from one cell that's dividing to the other. Now, if there's a lot of damaged mitochondria that goes to one cell, then the mitochondria detect that or sense that, and it will send out signals such that the cell would commit suicide.
Mitophagy is an excellent process because it recognizes damaged mitochondria, and if mitochondria are damaged, they produce less ATP, and besides, they stimulate production of reactive oxygen species. If these mitochondria are eliminated, it will be really beneficial for cells and for organisms in general. Some cells can become dangerous for us. And if cell doesn't fulfill its function, it's better to kill it. In cancer, for example, apoptotic program is suppressed. That leads for uncontrolled growth of tissue. That's why if you stimulate cell death, apoptotic cell death, you might cure cancer. Apoptotic cell death is painless. I read that every day in our body, about 1.2 kilograms of cells die by apoptosis, but we don't feel it. But it's necessary form of cell death because cells divide, proliferate, and to keep shape and form of our organs, some cells should die. In cancer, as I mentioned, apoptosis is suppressed. But if we have too much apoptosis, this might lead to different neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease. So it must be really balanced.
But mitochondria are very dynamic. They are produced and they do mitophagy or autophagy all the days of your life. But what is important about mitochondria is that as you get older, it has the propensity to produce more and more dysfunctional mitochondria because the mitochondrial DNA actually mutates very rapidly. The body has mechanisms to get rid of those, but as you get older, those mechanisms also become inefficient. So there's about that window that has been talked about in terms of longevity, where the mitochondria cannot catch up anymore in terms of the mitochondrial biogenesis and in terms of the number of mitochondria getting dysfunctional and getting destroyed, such that now the body will go into aging and senescence. So that's how the mitochondria are in the body in terms of from growth in childhood all the way to determining at what age you're actually going to start growing senescent or incurring the frailty syndrome.
Whether mitochondria are the cause of a disease or the cause is somewhere else, and on the way of the disease is being progressing, mitochondria are being affected. But in the end, mitochondria certainly are involved because, don't forget, we only exist because we have energy. And we only have energy because we have mitochondria. Without mitochondria, everything is dead.
The loss of energy function or the loss of energy actually precedes all of these mutations that are being blamed for the existence of cancer. So we just have to move the window one level to the left rather than looking at center and looking at what's happening before the mutations actually occur and what's driving the mutations. So it behooves us to take a look at the mitochondria, its function, what it's doing at the time during carcinogenesis, how much energy is actually being produced to regulate cell division, for example, to regulate the ROS production, and other things that the mitochondria are lesser known for, but are as equally important.
The mitochondria in your cells decide whether or not you're going to get most kinds of cancer. And if they are poisoned by the environment, they're poisoned by your food, there are other things going on, when they realize they can no longer effectively take air and food to make energy, they say, well, I'm going to make energy some other way. And they start making energy through a process that's more like fermentation that requires a lot less air. They become something called pseudo-hypoxic. And when this happens, you get cancer. And you can turn this around. And just by taking care of your mitochondria, you reduce your incidence of every kind of disease, including cancer and heart disease and diabetes, all the big killers, Alzheimer's, all of them improve when your mitochondria improve.
It is actually scary that one of the major causes of admission in adults is hip fracture. And they found out that it's actually not because they fell and broke their hip. It's actually because they're falling and they were able to grasp onto something, but they were unable to withstand their own weight, and they let go and had to fall. So there's that muscle weakness that's in there. And you have muscle weakness, a condition called sarcopenia if you have less muscle cells, right? And that is due to lack of energy being produced from mitochondrial function. And one of the things in the elderly is called frailty syndrome, and frailty syndrome actually touches on the very things that have very high numbers of mitochondria in them with very little energy reserve. So the brain goes, you have poorer memory, poorer recall. You ask them, what they ate this morning, they won't remember. Then you have heart diseases, then you can have kidney dysfunction. And then the other is, of course, muscular dysfunction, and it's manifested in sarcopenia because you have less mitochondria in there that's delivering energy, or you have mitochondria, but they're actually defective and cannot produce as much energy for you to execute what you're supposed to do. So movement, on the other hand, maintains the blood flow, oxygenation, exerts a dynamic tension on the muscles, So what happens in there is that you have the necessary signals, mechanical signals especially, that maintain the size and shape of your muscle cells. And therefore, by doing that, you're actually telling your body, hey, I am still functional, I am still doing all of these things, I'd like you to maintain me. And so your body actually adapts to those kinds of movements because the body is highly adaptive.
So my father turned 70 last month, and he wasn't in the best shape. I remember him telling me 3 months before his 70th birthday that a doctor had told him that if he didn't do something about his body, he'd be lucky if he survived the next 5 years. Because, after a certain age, you start losing between 1 to 3% of your muscles every year. And do you know what's the leading cause of preventable death for men and women in America beyond 70? It's falling down. It's because they lose so much musculature, their bodies can't survive a fall.
But when you see, kind of MRI scans of well-trained, physically active individuals in their later years, in comparison to those who are well-trained in their middle ages or younger, there's pretty much identical muscle mass. They have the same ability of agility and coordination and strength and endurance as they had in their younger years, because they're maintaining far more of that because they're continuing their practice for as long as possible. Villages in the back of the beyond, where we see people continuing to function as they always have done, and if you ever ask them their age and you go, oh, she's probably about 65, 70 years old, and they'll let you know that, oh, actually I'm 90 years old, and you're like, oh my goodness, what? It's incredible. What have you done today? Oh, I walked several miles. I'm still out in the garden. I still pretty much do everything that I've always done because I have no choice. There isn't anyone to help me. I have to do this. And they maintain their cognitive function and ability, and they maintain their sense of independence. The more we do and set ourselves up in our younger years, and the more that we maintain that into our middle age, into our older adulthood, will prevent us that kind of really rapid decline that can occur by not doing anything, by being sedentary.
The biggest misconception that we have is that the answer for your pain and your suffering can be found in a pill. If you look at chronic pain, so in the United States, we have 100 million Americans, which is pretty much 1 out of every 3 people who struggle with chronic pain, and those numbers are similar throughout the world. And over the Of course, in the last 50 years, we have done a lot with pharmaceuticals and trying different types of things, everything from anti-inflammatories to narcotic opioids. And we've actually seen that none of those things work long term. So they may take the edge off temporarily, just a little bit. But as far as a long-term solution, they really have failed. The data supports that. And it doesn't help people with their function, doesn't help people decrease their pain and increase their quality of life.
Instead of saying, oh, you have osteopenia or osteoporosis, don't worry, we can give you some medication, we can give you some calcium supplementation, we can resolve this. We could say to people, actually, do some weight-bearing activity. That's going to do just as well, if not more effective, a stimulus to your body physically than anything that we could provide in prescription form. A kind of exercise prescription, a movement prescription, I feel should be just as much a part and parcel of what GPs prescribe as not even just as much, far more important a prescription for health to combat a lot of chronic lifestyle disease.
We spent a lot of years looking at physical structure and the biomechanics of the body, so to speak, and that's important. We still have to look toward how the body functions, how it moves, how strong you are, how flexible you are. But when you look at people in their 90s or 100s, there are many people that function just fine, but their spine doesn't have the perfect curve you want to see in it, or maybe they have one knee that lacks a little bit of flexibility, but yet they're absolutely 100% pain-free. One of the things I love to do is educate people about what the alternatives are. And once they're opened up to what the alternatives are, then they start to say, I'm going to go in that direction and leave this because I've tried this for long enough and it hasn't worked. Your body has a wonderful ability to heal itself. And your body has an amazing ability to overcome that inflammatory process. So really within about 7 to 3 months, that inflammatory process is done. No matter what you do, your body is going to heal itself innately. It's in you, it's been that way for decades. The challenge with chronic pain is that pain can continue even once the healing process has ended. So you'll see that the inflammation is gone, but for some reason, the brain is still paying attention to that part of the body and still feels that there's danger there, even though that healing has happened.
The brain is the most metabolically hungry organ in the body. When you're an adult, the brain uses up 25% of your basal metabolic rate. So 25% of every breath you take and of every meal you eat goes to fuel the ravenous energy needs of your brain. And actually, as a newborn, the human newborn's brain accounts for 90% of its base metabolic rate. So the brain is a very needy, codependent organ. I mean, we're kind of stuck with this relationship with our brain, but I think it's for the best because our brains really make everything that we love to do in life possible.
As people go through the lifespan and get older and they lose brain function, they first notice they can't swallow as well. They can't take a lot of pills at the same time. They have to drink water. They can choke up on their own saliva, and or even before that, they start to get constipation and gut motility. And those things could be just because the brain itself is starting to degenerate. So as we age and we lose our brain function, we also lose our vagal function. Within the brainstem, there's the key output center for the digestive system called the vagus nerve. And input from the brain goes to the brainstem, hits a group of nerve nuclei, or nerves clustered together called the vagus nuclei. And this vagus nuclei then wanders, and in Latin, vagus means wandering nerve. And this nerve goes all the way down through all the different centers in the autonomic system, like your heart and into your GI tract and into your gallbladder. And then input from the vagus has many functions. There's what are called autonomic functions, where it controls the smooth muscles of the gut, so your muscles contract and carry food, so you can move and digest them. It impacts enzyme release, so your gallbladder can release bile and break down fats, and your pancreas can release pancreatic enzymes and break down starch and hydrochloric acid. Those are all controlled by the vagus nerve. And there's also blood flow dynamics, so the amount of blood flow you get to your intestines is all controlled by the vagus. So many times we really think of the gut and go, it's just the foods we eat that impact it, and there's bacteria there and they should all be healthy, but it's more to it than that. When you see a patient who's got vagal tone issues, there's some very clear clinical patterns you see. First of all, they have constipation. The key thing with the vagus is that it controls gastrointestinal motility or movement of food. So there's the people that have to have things like magnesiums or some kind of laxative or coffee to have bowel movements. That's a characteristic finding of people that have vagal issues. The second one is they've done everything for the gut. Nothing helps. that they don't know what to do anymore. They've cleaned up their diet, they've taken every probiotic, digestive enzyme. That's another key that they may have lost their vagal activity. And somewhere along the timeline, you see something like a traumatic brain injury that has caught up with them, or a neurodegenerative response. They're starting to lose their cognitive decline or something like that, or they're a child that has a developmental disorder, the brain hasn't developed well. Those things are big clues that a person's chronic GI issues may be coming from the vagus nerve.
When we look at these neurodegenerative conditions, you know, the roots really, it's funny, people think that they catch Parkinson's early when there's a tremor, and we know that that's not early. That's really kind of late when we're looking at things, especially in functional neurology. Some of the early signs we have of it is just chronic constipation. So we know the gut's a big player in all of this. And we know that some of the things that can trigger these neurodegenerative conditions are when you get that imbalance in the microbiome and when you get chronic infections in the gut, and they can basically crawl up the vagus nerve into the brain. One of the ways we know that that's the case is there have been studies that have been done where they introduce these infectious agents into the gut, and if they clip the vagus nerve, it doesn't get into the brain, you don't see the neurodegeneration. But in the subjects that still have the vagus nerve intact, it crawls up there. And then that starts that whole degenerative condition. I work a lot with kids that are teenagers and in their 20s. You look at the crap that they're eating. The stuff like Flamin' Hot Cheetos, you know, Takis and the Rockstars and the Monsters, they're getting all this monosodium glutamate, they're getting aspartame, they're getting these excitatory neurotoxins. So we know the negative impact that has on them. We know that when they're eating all these high amounts of sugars, that's stimulating a whole kind of you're getting those advanced glycosylated end products that are going on. That's creating neurodegeneration as well. And again, that's in the teens and the 20s that we're already seeing that.
Our health is not good. I mean, you step off the plane at any airport in the United States and obesity is rampant. Type 2 diabetes is rampant. And my interest really in how this all affects the brain looks at those very same factors that will cause a person to become obese or cause a person to become a type 2 diabetic. You know, when you are a type 2 diabetic, that diagnosis is made once your blood sugar becomes chronically elevated. But chronically elevated insulin can occur in the body for 10 years before it has any effect on your fasting level of blood sugar. So, and that, you know, wreaks havoc on the brain all the while.
During the day, we're accumulating all these toxins in our nervous system. And specifically, we have these proteins that are starting to gunk up. We call them neurofibrillary tangles. And a lot of people develop them normally, not even just people with dementia or Alzheimer's, but it's just the amount, the density, and where they're located that ends up leading to symptoms of dementia or Alzheimer's. And so when we sleep at night, our nervous system, our immune system, the wisdom of our brains and our bodies starts to chew those proteins up, recycle them to be used for new things like neurotransmitters so we can function optimally. But when we don't sleep at night, then those proteins start to gunk up, creating toxic load on our brains, leading to things like forgetfulness, irritability, brain fog. And at the end of the game, so to speak, things like dementia, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's disease.
There's no such thing as a chemical imbalance in the brain. It doesn't exist. You can't have too much or too little of a specific neurotransmitter. It's kind of a fallacy. What you can have are signaling systems that are weak, or receptors that aren't sensitive enough, or not enough receptors. So there is a tuning of the whole system, but the absolute level of a neurotransmitter is fairly meaningless to some extent. Let me give you one aging example. There's an aging problem called Parkinson's, which is a movement disorder that is largely bound up in dopamine as the neurotransmitter. And dopamine is made, a lot of it's made in the brain in a part called the pars compacta of the substantia nigra, the dense part of the black stuff. And this is the area deep in the brain, in the basal ganglia, which is involved with movement and motor learning. And the basal ganglia pumps out dopamine really your whole life. And if you start to have a drop-off in dopaminergic cells, if they start to die, eventually you get Parkinsonian symptoms, which are problems moving or tremor, as well as executive function problems like ADHD that come from dopamine as well. So these problems show up in Parkinson's, but only once you've lost 75 or 80% of your dopamine neurons. There's no symptoms up until that point. So the system is able to tune its receptor density, its amount of dopamine really, really well until it's less than 20% of the residual signaling system, and then symptoms show up. So that 80% variability is a range within which the brain can actually adjust. So this underscores the idea that the amount of a neurotransmitter is somewhat meaningless. What really matters is oscillatory dynamics, or the sensitivity of signaling systems in the brain.
Neurotransmitters are messengers of communication. They allow our brain cells to talk to one another. And the cool thing about neurotransmitters is that they all have these special personalities. So there's dopamine, which is kind of like that really excited guy at the party, who's just ready to go and like really passionate about neurology and mitochondria, And then there's the neurotransmitter GABA, which is like the calm guy, who's chilling at the beach, just getting ready to ride the waves with his surfboard. And then there's glutamate, which is the one that's really on point, always like making sure things are turned on and going, right? Serotonin is the neurotransmitter, the one that deals with mood, as well as sleep cycles, as well as pain relief, actually. So a lot of people who have issues with serotonin, they end up feeling depressed and nothing cheers them up. If it's cloudy out, they feel depressed. Or they might even experience pain or digestive issues, because the serotonin, that molecule, not only impacts the brain, but also impacts the digestive system, as well as the spinal cord, this area we call the pontomedullary reticular formation, that controls our brain's ability to dampen pain. Because a lot of people who experience pain, it's not even because they have an injury, it's because the brain remembers that. But the good news is our brain also has devised these ways of creating a calming response of pain, and serotonin is a really important one for that.
So the more activity you do, the more mitochondria you make. Now, as you make mitochondria, those cells function longer. And when you look at the brain, you have to have activity of neurons to have a healthy brain. So when neurons stop firing and working, there's cells around them called glial cells, and they're like Pac-Mans, and they eat them up. So once you start losing your brain thinks those cells are dead, and they start actually eating into your neurons. Now, the more active your brain is and the more ATP you have, the more baseline activity those neurons have, so it's less prone for neurodegeneration. So when you're looking at the brain, physical exercise, movement has a major impact, but actually cognitive activity too. So for example, if you hate numbers and math and you haven't activated that part of your brain, which is your left inferior parietal cortex, over time, your left inferior parietal cortex degenerates. And then you have lost there because you haven't used it, and those mitochondria have not been developing, and then those cells start to lose their general function, and the glial cells around them start to chew them up. So mitochondrial function is underlying part of aging and brain function and health.
Circadian rhythms and rhythms in general are just so important for health, especially brain health. There's another important rhythm that not all of us are very aware of, but it's so important when it comes to our health. That's ultradian rhythms. So the circadian rhythm, we talk about this 24-hour cycle, right? But there are these ultradian rhythms where it's more like a 90 to 120 minute cycle, where every 90 minutes or so we get in these states where we could be super focused, we have energy, we're like on point. And then in about like 90 minutes to 120 minutes, we start to get a little spacey. And how you might notice is you might start to yawn, you might start to fidget in your chair, you feel like you need to stretch, right? And so that's a signal from our nervous system, from our brain saying, okay, man, it's time to take a break. But as you know, many of us in modern society, it's just like, there's so many things to do. You got the email list, you got social media, bling, bling, right? That Portlandia episode, you know what I'm talking about? Yeah. Don't cut that was great. It's like all this constant stimuli, and we feel this obligation to always like be plugged in. And so what ends up happening, we do, and a lot of times we could kind of like fight through it, but at the expense of the brain, at the expense of our brain health. Because we end up releasing cortisol and adrenaline. After long periods of time where we're under this chronic release of stress hormones, our brains start to feel that impact. And so one simple thing that you can do is every 90 to 120 minutes, become aware of that. And I guarantee if you just close your eyes or stand up and stretch or maybe go lie down on a patch of grass, and you come back, maybe even just 5 minutes of doing that, you're going to be even more productive and on point than before doing that.
So people tend to think that Alzheimer's disease, which is the most common form of dementia, is a genetic disease, and it's not. Alzheimer's disease can affect anybody. Everybody ultimately is at risk. There are genes that put you at increased risk, anywhere between 2 and 14-fold risk for developing Alzheimer's disease. That seems to be largely dependent on the environment in which those genes are thrust up against. There's a very small minority of Alzheimer's patients that have something called early onset familial Alzheimer's disease, and that make up 2 to 3% of the cases of Alzheimer's disease. It's a very niche form, and that is determined by genes. But for the most part, whether or not a person will develop Alzheimer's disease, it seems to be an epigenetic phenomena, a dance between genes and lifestyle. We wonder why so many of us turn to illicit drugs or prescription drugs or destructive behavior when our brains don't work the way that we want them to, when we feel anxious, when we feel depressed. I almost feel like if you don't feel anxious or occasionally depressed, then there's probably something wrong with you, because the world that we live in today is so far removed from that in which our brains evolved. When I left Current TV to try to figure out where I was going to go with my career, it was at that exact moment that my mom started to display signs of memory loss. And I didn't know it at the time, but those signs were the earliest symptoms of what would eventually manifest as dementia. She was very young. She was 58 when the symptoms first emerged. And because I couldn't chalk up what I was seeing to old age, my mom clearly wasn't the picture of somebody succumbing to the ravages of aging, and she had a lot of life left to live. It was at once traumatic, and it motivated me to really set out and learn everything that I possibly could about the etiology, the underlying pathologies that may contribute to dementia, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease. And what I learned at the time shook me to my core. I think like many people believed that dementia, and specifically Alzheimer's disease, was an old person's disease. But I realized that I was completely wrong, because Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia and neurological diseases and other forms of chronic disease, just generally speaking, begin far earlier than the emergence of symptoms. So you take Alzheimer's disease begins in the brain 30 to 40 years before the first symptom.
So when we look at disease, we have to look at it as a blessing. I look at disease like a life raft. You might not like the life raft, there might be water coming into it, it might be really uncomfortable, it might be cold on the life raft, but guess what? You're in a position now where you can be saved. You didn't sink with the rest of the ship. So if we look at disease from that perspective, now we can look at it as a blessing. Our physiology adapted to give us enough time to actually find a solution. And most cancers actually don't kill people. Somebody doesn't just drop dead and they find out they have cancer on an autopsy, right? It's usually this long, drawn-out process. I mean, most of what kills people is the idea that they're going to die from that cancer. That's the number one cause of death. People who want to live longer, and they might live 3, 4, 5 years longer than the doctor told them, but they still in their mind believe that they're going to die from this problem, and they're fighting the cancer instead of building vitalistic health. And so that becomes their focus. And what we focus on only expands in our lives. So there's an emotional component to cancer. I think a lot of people who develop cancer have emotional baggage that they haven't addressed. And those that get mad when I say that probably have emotional baggage that they haven't addressed. And that's why they're not willing to accept that. So there's that component to it. And, it's just one of those things that if you look at it as a blessing, it completely changes your perspective. And a lot of times, again, the cancers don't kill people, they just crowd out organs, right? And it's metaphoric for our lives, right? So the more that emotion crowds out our happiness, the more that tumor is going to crowd out health in our body.
In the beginning of my cancer journey, I was really focused on not dying, and then someone said, I met with a practitioner, and this practitioner in our first meeting, she said, you know, before we get started, I need to know, do you really want to live? And I was like, well, no one's ever asked me that before. I've never even asked myself, and I'm not even sure what the answer is. And that was a scary moment. I mean, for like a split second, it was kind of like my life was flashing before my eyes. And I was, on one hand, I was a little bit afraid that maybe I secretly had a death wish, right? And that maybe this cancer was my body manifesting this, you know, hidden death wish, me hating myself, being insecure, unhappy, right? And then I kind of had this little epiphany, which was, I have a choice here. Like, and I'm going to choose. Yes, I want to live, right? I'm making the choice to live. And so from that moment forward, everything I did was to promote health and healing in my body, right? It wasn't to kill cancer. It wasn't to not die, right? It was to live. So people know me online as Chris Beat Cancer, okay? But knowing what I know now, that's probably not what I would have called my website or my blog. Because even though I'm cancer-free, there's no cancer in my body, I don't look at cancer as something that you just beat or cure, right? I look at it as it's disease, it needs to be healed, but the risk factors in our diet and our environment and our lifestyle are so pervasive that if you want to stay cancer-free, if you want to live a long, healthy life and not die from cancer, then you have to be serious about prevention.
Cancer with a capital C that we all fear so much is really an example of a profound resilience within the cells in our body. And the fact that these cells, you can throw weapons grade, you know, chemotherapy and radiation at these cells, and they're sitting there laughing. In fact, if you throw radiation, let's say radiotherapy wavelengths at a breast cell that isn't cancerous, it will actually exhibit stem-like properties and will regress to a less differentiated state, which is characteristic of the cancer phenotype, which confers profound resilience against anything you throw at it. So in many ways, the very thing that we're so afraid of, and that does end up taking a good number of lives, is an example of a inconceivably vast self-healing, self-regenerating power. So the cancer paradox is the very thing that kills us is the immortal, hyper-resilient capabilities of the very cells themselves.
There are two philosophies about how cancer arises. One is the mitochondrial theory of cancer, and the other is the genetic theory of cancer. And there are camps that hold on tight to both of those, but in fact, both are true. So one side, and the more pervasive idea about cancer historically has been that the DNA gets damaged, a cell becomes aberrant, it goes haywire, it has abnormal behavior, the immune system doesn't recognize it, it continues to proliferate, and then a tumor forms. That's what historically we've taught, that's what cancer is. Now, because we understand more about the mitochondria, we understand that there's signaling between the nucleus of a cell where the DNA is and the mitochondria. So it's also possible that the initiating event is when the mitochondria becomes stressed and damaged. But mitochondria has its own DNA. Mitochondria are incredibly sensitive little organisms also, so they easily get stressed and damaged. So the mitochondria could be where the insult happened first, and it's likely that in our toxic environment, that's what's happening today. There's another theory about cancer cells, and that is that cancer cells are very much like single-celled organisms, and that they have all the survival strategies of a single-celled organism like a bacteria or a virus, and that they co-opt the normal physiology in order to survive. And so there is this underlying philosophy in oncology called the hallmarks of cancer. And these are characteristics of tumor cells that describe how tumor cells co-opt our normal physiology for their own ends. So an example of that is a tumor cell. If you have a few cells that have become damaged and replicated and divided, you have this little ball of cells, if it's tiny, under 3 millimeters, then that little ball of cells can get all its nutrients from the immediate environment by osmosis. But if that needs to grow, it can't. That little ball of cells can't grow. So that's what happens. Most of us have little balls of tumor cells like that. Our immune system keeps the lid on it. That little ball of cells hasn't figured out how to survive, and so it either dies or just stays small like that. But if it wants to grow, what happens is the middle of that becomes starved of oxygen. And then a signal is sent that we need oxygen, we need oxygen. And so a signal is sent, and a capillary nearby starts to bud and bring oxygen and a blood supply to that little tiny ball of cells. And then once there's a blood supply there, then that ball of cells can grow exponentially into a mass. Not only can it grow because it has nutrients and oxygen, it is now connected to the circulatory system and can metastasize. So that's an example of a hallmark of cancer. Of wound healing includes that process of angiogenesis, making new blood vessels. But a cancer cell has co-opted that process so that it can grow.
I think that Warburg had a lot of things right. And if you really get into that research and look at what's developed since then, you really will come to understand and appreciate that cancer is a metabolic disease, first and foremost, and that when cancer develops, it can lead to genomic mutations within that cell type, but that's an after effect. We know that certain DNA polymorphisms can predispose somebody towards having certain risk factors that can lead to cancer in certain circumstances. We know that that's potentially true, but we have to appreciate that cancer as a disease is first and foremost metabolic, and that means that it's going to metabolize glucose. Hyperfermentation of glucose is going to happen.
We have seen that cancer relates to mitochondrial dysfunction and leakage of metabolites of the Krebs cycle, of the cycle that produces energy within the mitochondria. When there is a blockage and they leak out from the mitochondria and they get picked from the nucleus, this activates some genes and deactivates the suppressors of the oncogenes. So that, what does it mean? It means that our DNA contains the format, the mode of operation to turn a normal cell into a cancer cell. But this operation is suppressed. So under certain circumstances that the more they depart from normal operation, the more easily it is to get these oncogenes activated, our cells becomes cancerous in a last attempt to survive. Because if our cells perceive that as a body, as a system, as a biological system, the possibility to survive is going down, they try at least to survive as cells and activate these oncogenes that activate contemporarily a lot of mechanisms that makes the cells more harsh, more resistant. They can, cancer cells, they can function better than normal cells in less oxygen, with less amount of food. They produce their own blood vessels. They are more reactive to the immune system, and they have a lot of mechanisms that make them more resilient. So yes, we have a lot of data accumulating in the late years that cancer is a metabolic disease.
The other main function of the mitochondria that influences cancer physiology is the ability to produce energy. So the mitochondria are the factory for ATP, the unit of energy in our cells. And cancer cells have damaged mitochondria, so they shift their metabolism. Now, that allows us to leverage their vulnerability to treat cancer. But those two pieces of mitochondrial function, the loss of normal apoptosis and the loss of normal cell metabolism for the production of energy, those are the two areas where cancer cells are different from healthy normal cells.
But cancer cells are just very good at doing one thing, you know, and just keep growing when there's excess of everything. Excess sugar, excess amino acids, excess growth factor, or certainly high levels of all of those. And I think when you remove, when you change the environment, and now the cancer has evolved also,
people don't think as cancer is evolving, but cancer evolves. And that evolution happened with a lot of nutrients, a lot of growth factors around. And so I think all of a sudden you remove that and they struggle. But if you remove that and then you add the chemotherapy, that's when that struggle can become lethal and kill every single one of the cancer cells, because it's such a powerful combination.
It's important to be able to think of oneself as free of cancer, but we're never free of cancer risk once we've been a cancer patient. So that means we have to have a health model. We have to have a way to create a body where cancer cannot thrive so that those microscopic cells never do anything. The very first question that I'm always asked is, what should I eat? I'm a cancer patient, what should I eat? So I always talk about what are the big levers, because it's too overwhelming to say everything on the first visit. So what are the big levers? The most important thing to start with is get all the chemicals out of your diet. And so sometimes it's easiest just to say stop eating packaged food. Stop eating processed food. Eat things that are whole, fresh, unadulterated, and unprocessed. By doing that, you remove most of the chemicals from your diet. So that's usually the first step. And that's true for all patients, actually. But many cancer patients are less efficient at dealing with chemicals than are patients who don't have cancer. So it's more important for them. Another very, very important big lever in the cancer terrain, the physiology of cancer, is the signaling from insulin and glucose. Many cancer cells have more glucose receptors and insulin receptors on their surface. So insulin is the big signal for growth. We know that's true in breast cancer, for example. So by eating a diet that doesn't trigger insulin and keeps insulin and glucose in the lowest quartile of normal, then we stop that growth signal from being there. And that is the underlying principle of the ketogenic diet for cancer patients, is to lower insulin and glucose. But a ketogenic diet is a therapeutic diet, so you need some nutritional guidance. I've had patients who try to do the ketogenic diet on their own and have become hospitalized or get severe diarrhea. So I think it's misunderstood that the ketogenic diet is not magic for cancer patients. It is a diet that stresses tumor cells. So I recommend that maybe a day or two before you might have chemotherapy or radiotherapy, so the cells are more stressed. And the rest of the time you can eat a low glycemic, a low glucose, low starch, low carb diet that's chemical free. So those are important. And the other thing is an anti-inflammatory diet, because cancer itself is a super inflammatory syndrome. So again, we go back to a plant-based diet is more anti-inflammatory, and a diet with plenty of healthy fats and oils in it is anti-inflammatory. And then the next principle is eat a lot of color, eat the rainbow, because all those plant chemicals, all those phytochemicals, all those pigments that are in plants that give all that color not only are the presence of nutrients, but the presence of plant chemicals that enter the nucleus and signal cancer suppressor genes. And so we want to be able to turn on cancer suppressor genes and turn off cancer promoter genes, and that's what a lot of those pigments do. And so those are the basic principles, and adequate hydration. Those are the most important things.
Healing happens in phases, and it's a process. And healing is kind of like the stock market, right? It goes up a little and then it comes down a little, and it goes up a little more and then it comes down a little, right? So there's ups and downs in the healing process. I looked at it as an adventure, right? So there was a lot of learning, there's a lot of exploration, there was a lot of trying new things and trying to figure out, like, what in my life is out of sync with nature, right? So I was really thinking about how can I get in harmony with nature? And I was thinking about the way we live in the world now, and all these modern conveniences and all this modern technology. And maybe some of it is contributing to my disease. So then as I'm looking around, like I live in this electrified box, right? And I'm thinking about my sleep habits. And I'm like, well, you know, if I was living in the wilderness, or even if I was camping, right? Studies have shown now that
if you're camping for a week without any artificial light, when the sun goes down, your body starts producing melatonin. But in people that live in houses with artificial electricity and light, their body doesn't start producing melatonin for 2 hours later. So they essentially get about 90 minutes less melatonin in their body. Why does that matter? Well, melatonin is one of the most powerful anti-cancer hormones in your body. Stress was it's a big thing for cancer. Every cancer patient I've ever met had major stress in their life. And I realized one of the key elements of stress in my life, and that I see present in every cancer patient, was bitterness and resentments and unforgiveness. So those negative emotions that we carry with us toward people that have hurt us in the past. And I was like, you know what? I just want to get well. I don't even care about that stuff anymore. Like, I'm going to forgive everybody who's ever hurt me, and, you know, like, just forgive like crazy. And be quick to forgive when people piss me off.
Ayurvedic medicine says that autoimmune disease and cancer are undigested anger. So we often think about inflammation as just being a cellular or a tissue thing in the physical body. But in fact, if you have inflammatory thoughts, then that's going to follow into the body. And so what I realized is I needed to do forgiveness work every night. Every night I go to bed and I ask for forgiveness for hurting others, for taking on other people's hurt, and I forgive myself. And it's a nightly practice now. And oftentimes people leave behind forgiving themselves. So when I was in my very early 30s, I had rheumatoid arthritis, and I had to forgive my sexual abuser from the age of 10. And I had to go through this whole process that I described. Well, when I was 40, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. And at that time, my second son of my 4 children had sat me down and said, Mom, I need to let you know something. We were sexually, the 3 older kids were sexually abused by a neighborhood boy. And that is the worst thing I could ever imagine for my children. And I just broke out into this blood-curdling scream, cried. I couldn't even believe that I had allowed this to happen to my children. And I said, why didn't you tell me this? He was 18 or 20 at the time when he told me. So he'd only been about 5 years old when it happened. And he said, because of this, I didn't want to hurt you. And I just went, ugh. And so then that was an added layer of, oh my gosh, they've been living with this their whole lives because they were afraid of burdening me. So 4 months after this happened, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. This lovely little tumor right over my heart in my left breast. And when I felt this lump, I went in, I had an ultrasound, it had this amazing blood supply pulsating to it. It was alive and well. And I looked at it and I said, I know exactly where that came from. I just knew why I had it. It was so obvious. I had not forgiven myself at all. I'd gone through this incredible experience, of facilitating this beautiful, loving forgiveness of my children forgiving me in that 4-month period. And they were so cool. I took them to counseling, they responded, they were so good. And then I wound up with cancer. So I went home from the ultrasound appointment and I said, okay, I need to find this guy. So I located him and I called him. And he said, I've been waiting for this call for 15 years. And I just said, why did you do this? That's what I really need to know right now. And it was not a misuse of power like it had been for my vice principal. It was actually curiosity and experimentation of a kid. And so we had a talk about it and then facilitated this incredible forgiveness work with him. I had him talk to each of my kids. Again, we did some counseling and I was able to forgive him, but then I realized I had to forgive me, and that was the hardest of them all because I felt so much shame. I blamed myself. Of course it was my fault. I had left my kids with this kid because I felt like they would probably rather play outside than come to the grocery store with me. So basically I'd been lazy and I couldn't forgive myself for that. Just one thing, what if? What if is all I could say. What if I had just said, come on, we're going to the grocery store? And that would have changed everything. So I did this really deep work around, oh, I learned to understand that I signed up for my parents and probably the events I went through so I could learn to do what I do in this world. And so probably they did too. And that this was all part of their lives and their paths and not even about me. And I was able to get my own egomaniacal self out of the way and forgive myself. And within a month, my cancer was gone.
So almost 3 years ago, our son Ryder, who's now 4, was diagnosed with stage 4 neuroblastoma. When we started chemotherapy, we knew that we had a choice in what we did to support Ryder. And there are not only supplements that are very anti-cancer and, foods and, the juices that we were making, but there's also chemoprotective supplements, and we were doing that as well. And certain things we wouldn't do during a round of chemotherapy, and we would up something else.
We didn't have to have everything figured out perfectly, and that's what I always try to stress to people today, that we work with parents one-on-one now that are going through this and try to help them get past the learning curve a little quicker than we did, and that's what I always try to tell people, is you don't have to feel like you know it all and have some perfect protocol. Just taking action in and of itself is going to make you feel better that you're actually doing something, as opposed to just sitting back and, hoping everything turns out for the best.
And it's very empowering, and you feel like as a parent, it's the one thing that you do have control on, because everything else feels so out of control, and, it's your child. It's, you would die for your child, and you don't need to just sit there and watch them suffer. Like for us, that's, I think, what kept our sanity, even though we may have looked like crazy people to everybody else. Like, we knew what we were doing.
Once I got well and, certified cancer-free, tests and CT scans and all that stuff over many years, my focus hasn't changed, right? My focus is I'm healthy, I feel good, I don't have any chronic disease, and I want to stay that way. And so I exercise actively, like every day, pretty much 5-6 days a week I'm exercising. And I eat super healthy, not because I want to be healthy today, but because I want to be healthy tomorrow. Anytime I talk to someone who's been first diagnosed with cancer, the first 2 things I want to figure out is, does this person want to live? Just like someone asked me that. And if the answer is yes, then the next question is, are you willing to change your entire life?
When people are faced with the challenge of chronic disease, they have a very scary road in front of them, because they're getting input from a variety of people, all of whom think they have the right solution, some of which are way outside of convention, some of which are you have to follow the traditional medical models and medical interventions. And these are in essence life and death decisions. My point of view is that I encourage people to not wait till you have a big problem before you try to conclude on what your point of view is about health. Do you think that your body has extraordinary recuperative powers, and that if you can unleash those powers and remove things that interfere with that program, that you can overcome chronic diseases and other illnesses when they occur? Or do you think you're born deficient, that you're not equipped to be able to deal with diseases when they occur? Therefore, I have to look for more radical interventions that come from maybe traditional allopathic care or medical care, et cetera. So there's a lot of considerations.
And so what we really try to empower people to do is to recognize that God truly gave your body the ability to heal itself under the right conditions. And when you need it, that's when medical intervention is required. And we are also big proponents of integrative healthcare. Like, I'm talking true integrative healthcare, which means you can use natural therapies, conventional therapies, homeopathic, whatever it might be, all in unison. So cancer patients, autoimmune patients, it's not an all or nothing thing.
Most diagnoses happen early, and most patients have a lot more time than they're led to believe. And so don't let anyone rush you in. Don't let anyone use fear as a weapon against you to talk you into doing something that you don't feel right about doing, right? Whether it's surgery, whether it's chemo, whether it's radiation, doesn't matter, right? I'm not saying those things are bad, but I'm saying if in your instincts, your gut, your intuition is telling you, like, I don't need to be doing this, It doesn't matter how many people tell you need to do it. You probably shouldn't do it.
So the tipping point for the patients that we work with a lot using indigenous ancestral traditions is when they start taking responsibility for the disease that they have. There's a really cool quote that came in the wee hours one night down in the jungle from one of the shamans. He said, "Nick, you have it all wrong. You know, we shamans, we don't heal our patients. We simply remove the blocks that are preventing our patients from healing themselves." So there's a really interesting interpretation of disease in the Amazon that I found really striking, and I think our patients did as well. In one of the cultures that we were working within, diseases are looked at as being mothers. You know, they consider diseases to be mothers. And I guess that seemed kind of counterintuitive by our, Western sensibilities, but they feel as though when you get sick, the spirit of this disease has become impregnated with you. And if you're willing to learn everything that that illness has to show you about yourself and the world around you and learn from it, then the mother will rebirth you into this world. Absolutely healthy, but a lot more knowledgeable about what's going on. If you don't, then you'll be rebirthed into another world, but not this one. The one mantra that I came away from the jungle with was that everything is medicine. Everything in this world is medicine. And if you're able to interpret challenges that way, then you can rise above them, but also learn from them.
In Eastern medicine, we look at the whole body, and the whole body is not separated from the mind, the soul, the spirit, and all elements that make this thing called me, me. And so if I have an issue with my knee, I'm also looking at the function of my digestion, the spleen, the stomach, and all of the different meridian systems that are running through there to be like, where is this weakness? How did this weakness emerge, right? Like when I go out into a field and I see a weed growing, it's not that I'm just going to go pluck that weed. What I want to do is look at the sample of the soil to see what environment created this opportunity for this weed to grow here in this field. So it's the same thing. You look at the body holistically and be like, what fundamental imbalance was there that led to this? And then how do we nourish everything in the ecosystem to bring balance in its entirety to the whole instead of just this part called the knee? Because then, you know what? Downstream, the ankle's going to go after this.
That intervention may need to be there. We may need surgery. We may need chemotherapy. We may need antibiotics, which, I know there can be a huge debate about whether antibiotics are necessary or not. There's going to be situations where we need antibiotics. But then what? We can't just look at those interventions in isolation of their impact on the body longer term. So the more we introduce those interventions, the more we need to be cognizant of what those interventions are doing to the person. What does it mean to remove an organ from the body and just say it doesn't matter? What does it mean to introduce high-dose antibiotics? What's the impact that has long term on the microbiome? How do we work with somebody who has a diagnosed condition to make sure that we're doing everything possible, whether that's autism, ADD, fibromyalgia, PCOS, some kind of cancer? What do we need to do to make sure everything is being done to reverse the situation, again, the terrain or the environment in which that condition manifested or in which those interventions are being introduced?
I think that people often are resigned to various conditions or symptoms that they have and think they're just a one-way street. And just a quick story, I saw a gentleman at a lecture once, was 300 pounds, 63 years old. He had diabetes, he had heart failure, he had angina, he had reflux, he had prostate issues, he had sexual dysfunction, he was on 9 medications, he had postnasal drip, he had leg swelling. I mean, he was a mess. And at 63, you think, okay, well, what are you going to do? But I said, listen, if you follow everything I say, you can get better. And he literally followed everything I said, which most people don't. And he lost 155 pounds. He reversed every single one of his diseases. At 70 years old, he's far healthier than he was at 50. And he's starting a new business, and he's on no medication. Now, in our world, angina, heart failure, diabetes don't go away. but they can, given the right inputs to the body and actually removing the things that are the problem.
Here's the interesting thing, because I've heard those same things. Well, I tried chiropractic, I've tried acupuncture, I tried these varying modalities. And it isn't that simple, because not all practitioners are the same. I've tried medicine, I've tried whatever it might be. You can't calibrate an entire healthcare system based on a single practitioner. There are good ones, there are bad ones, and maybe it's not even good and bad. It's what's the right one for you.
We have to remove our good, bad, black, white thinking about the toolbox we have and not be ideologues and say natural is better, because sometimes it isn't. Sometimes we have a great tool and it has some toxicity, but it's better than having a cancer recurrence. So it's often a complicated decision. It's not straightforward.
If we have an expectation that our body is always going to be healthy, then we're going to get upset and we're going to attach to that disease as the cause of our suffering, when in fact, that's not actually accurate. So you have to be willing to let go of your identity as a mother, a wife, a sister, an aunt, a brother, somebody that has been sexually abused, somebody that is in a marriage that's not happy, having a disease, whatever it is. Because who are you without that is your journey on this earth, is discovering that. Who am I is the most important question you can possibly ask, and one of the ways of doing that is by getting sick. Usually life has given you plenty of opportunities before you get sick to answer that question, but we don't pay attention. And so when we're cut out at the knees, that's when we finally have to start listening.
People need to understand about life change, right? If you really want to prevent disease, if you want to live a long life, like, it's easy to get fired up and motivated and make some changes. But determination is really what has to be in place to stick with your changes, right? We can all get motivated and eat healthy for a week. That's not going to help you, right? You have to be determined to get your health back, right? If you're sick. And that's where I had to dig deep and every day make those decisions, right? Just to take care of myself, to give my fear to God, to exercise, right? To not let worry and anxiety take over. And healing happens in sort of like a snowball fashion where you build this momentum. And just one day after the next, after the next, after the next, things start improving. And I've seen it in so many other people's lives. I saw it in my life. And you just got to stick with it.
Thank you for watching episode 8 of the Human Longevity Project. From the start, our goal was to provide a new perspective on disease and healthy aging. Hopefully, we've presented a few new insights that provide a better understanding of how we got here and some clarity on what we can do about it. As we near the end of the series, I want to give special thanks to all those who've become a Human Longevity Project ambassador. We are thrilled that you now have access to the series, plus all of the interviews in their entirety, MP3s, the action plan, and other great bonuses. Every purchase brings us one step closer to completing our mission of helping 1 million children and reducing the number of birth-related deaths worldwide. We're honored to give a portion of our proceeds to nonprofit organizations working to save the lives of mothers and newborns dying due to complications at birth and lack of care. There are only a few days left to buy the entire series, all of the interviews, and other bonuses for more than 50% off. Click the link below to purchase the series and join us on our mission. Thanks again for your love and support. I'll see you next time for the last episode.